Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're gonna go over the Ball Lightning Sorcerer. This build looked like it was gonna be amazing, so I started with it this season, and I'm happy to say it's every bit as good as it looked. Fantastic clear speed, great AoE damage, great single target damage, great survivability, but most importantly, it's just fun and easy to play. So let's dive into the Ball Lightning Sorcerer, which is easily one of the best builds in the game right now, and definitely the best build the Sorcerer has to offer. And if you'd prefer to follow a written guide when putting this build together, don't worry, I've got you covered. There's a link down in the description below to a written guide version of this that has everything listed out so that you can follow it easily when you're putting it together. You can put it on your second monitor, whatever. So let's go over the skills. The first thing we're going to do is grab Arc Lash. Arc Lash is going to be an amazing spammable. It's got nice cleave to it. And so this is going to be great for leveling with. You can pump 5 points into this if you want. Be sure to grab both of its passives here. You're going to take Enhanced Arc Lash, which is going to say that anytime you crit with it, it automatically hits a second time, which is huge because it is conal. So it's hitting everything a second time. And then also Flickering Arc Lash gives you 6% move speed per enemy hit with Arc Lash. So you're pretty much always going to have 18% increased move speed. Just feels so good when leveling early on in the game. You can just use this ability, Arc Lash, max it out. And while you're leveling, you're going to put 1 point into Fireball, and this is going to feel really good. Nice. All the way into World Tier 3 and even into World Tier 4 until you get to a point where those bosses at the end of the really high level Nightmare Dungeons or even the new bosses like Duriel, you need that extra single target damage. Then you're going to get rid of Fireball and you're going to slot the Firebolt enchant instead. And that's going to give you some extra single target damage. So the way this build works is you're going to have either Firebolt or Fireball. You don't ever need both at the same time. You'll slot Fireball enchant when you want AoE and clear speed. And when you really need single target damage and nothing else, you can take Firebolt. And when you take your point out of one of those things, you can put it right here, Elemental Dominance, which leads us to the core section. We're not going to take any core abilities with this. Our primary damage ability is a mastery ability, interestingly enough. So that means we don't take any abilities here. And instead, we're just going to grab the Devastation passive so that we can get to the Elemental Dominance passive. This says that our core and mastery skills deal 9% increased damage when cast above 50. And we're almost always casting our ability above 50 mana because our ability almost costs 50 mana. So we don't have very many opportunities to cast below that. So our mana will constantly tick above 50 before we cast our ability. So we're almost always going to get this 9% increased damage. Before we continue, let me take a second to tell you about the sponsor of today's video. Nexus Wars hosts 4 unique races, each with their own heroes, architectural style, special unit, and civilization bonus. I think the coolest part about Nexus Wars is the RPG systems that allow the heroes like Zafar here to be leveled up and made stronger as you play. New players can claim this stoic, relentless hero by logging in for 7 days using the link in the description. Nexus Wars allows you to ally with millions of players all over the galaxy, so find like-minded players to form alliances with, and maybe we'll see each other on the battlefield. You can even explore the open world and uncover the mystery of Origin as you engage in epic, real-time battles with your friends, like the Siege of Ions, a 30 vs 30 battle between 2 alliances that takes place on a massive new map. Summon legendary interstellar heroes and powerful mechas for defense and conquest in the Nexus War, like this epic looking hero right here. Then defeat invaders to empower your hero. Level up your mechas by sending them into battle and defeating creeps, then upgrade their abilities using an RPG style talent tree and skill system. Nexus War allows you to personalize and plan your city, build massive megastructures like Titan docks, research labs, intelligence buildings, and more to form your own galactic fortress. I love that you can go into unknown areas and discover secrets hidden under the fog in the Nexus War map. Will you find old ruins, run into scary creatures, or dig up valuable treasures? Every turn in this huge world starts a new adventure. Enjoy Nexus Wars for free and support my channel by using the link in the description below to try the game out now. Use the exclusive gift code NWHeroPack with over $100 worth of rewards. Limited to 100 codes on a first come, first serve basis. Thanks for listening. Now let's get back to the video. Okay, next off in the defensive section, we're going to grab Frost Nova. Frost Nova is going to freeze the enemies around us. This is great for just, when you have a few elites jump on you at once, and that'll happen a lot in this season. And so you just freeze them and then you ball lightning them or you arc lash them or both and they melt. It's also going to be nice because it applies vulnerable. So that's going to be another 20% increased damage. And we're going to grab the first passive here, Enhanced Frost Nova, which says killing frozen enemies reduces this ability's cooldown by 1 second up to 4 times. So you can get a nice 4-second reduction on the cooldown of the ability, which is nice. And then we're going to take Mystical Frost Nova, Nova, which says that it applies vulnerable, right? So we'll grab those two. Then we're going to grab Flame Shield here. Flame Shield is going to make us immune to damage. That's huge. This is going to be your panic button. It's also going to make you unstoppable, which means we can use it to break free of CCs. Pretty much the only time you tend to die in Diablo once you get going is when your character gets crowd controlled, you can't move, and you have to watch as the enemy mercilessly slays your character. Well, that's what this ability is going to be for. It's going to remove the crowd control from you, making you unstoppable, and it's also going to heal you for 50% of your missing health. So it's also a nice dot, by the way. Don't be afraid to use this offensively early on in the game, especially in softcore, because the fire from the shield, you'll notice it melts enemies. So use it in conjunction with all your other damage abilities to kill things when you feel like it's safe to do so. Next, we're going to grab Teleport. Teleport is another ability that makes us unstoppable. This is two different sources of unstoppable, and this is important. We're going to take multiple different sources of unstoppable for multiple reasons. One, because it's going to keep us alive. That's free, get out of crowd control, but also there's a new item added to the game that is going to cause going unstoppable to give us 50 mana back. That is a lot. That's half of our starting mana pool given back to us. So going unstoppable is huge for our character. Teleport also, well, we teleport. We're going to grab the first passive, which says that it decreases the cooldown by up to 3 seconds when we teleport into enemies. And the next passive here, which reduces the damage we take by 30% for 3 seconds. That's exactly when we need 30% less damage, is when we're teleporting into the middle of enemies. So that's perfect for us. Then as far as the passives in this section go, we're going to put 1 point into Elemental Attunement. This is going to cause our crit strikes to have a 5% chance to reset the cooldown of one of these defensive abilities. And that's kind of important because these have long cooldowns. So getting a full cooldown reset on one of them is nice. It can only happen once every 10 seconds, but these are big abilities for us because of what they do, whether it's freezing enemies or making us unstoppable or healing us or giving us more mobility. And then we've got Glass Cannon here. Glass Cannon is going to be one of our biggest damage boosts in the game. Grab this one early when the game's really easy. Take 3 points and put him into this right away. It's going to be 18% increased damage. Boom. Just like that. The easiest 18% damage increase that you can get. You can also get another 3 points on your amulet. I think I had this up to like level 7 last season. I was getting 42% increased damage on my sorcerer just from this passive alone. It's insane, man. You can get lots of damage from it. So take advantage of that Glass Cannon passive. It is also going to increase the damage you take by 9%. So just kind of respect that, just be aware of that. But we're going to take some stuff that's also going to be reducing the damage that's incoming. It's really going to counteract that. Next, in the Conjuration section, we're going to take Precision Magic. This is going to give us 15% increased lucky hit chance. That's going to be great for our damage. It's going to be great for our sustain, having increased lucky hit chance. And we'll talk about that a little more in a second here. We're also going to put 1 point into Align the Elements, but that's so that we can get to Protection. And we're going to put 3 points into this because we want more barriers. This says that using any of our cooldown abilities, of which we have many, because we're a sorcerer, 30% of our maximum life is going to be given to us as a barrier for 3 seconds. And we are going to do more damage and have better sustain when we have a barrier up, basically. And of course, barriers, they make it so that you don't die. Anytime you have a barrier, that means the enemies are depleting your barrier instead of your health. So it's great for our survivability, great for our damage, great for our sustain to have the barrier up. So we want to have as much barrier uptime as possible. Now we're finally to the mastery section. This is where things really get interesting and exciting for this build because we're going to be using ball lighting. Ball lighting is going to be our bread and butter for our DPS. This ability is solid when it travels in a straight line before you get the aspect that makes it rotate around you. But once you get that aspect that makes it rotate around you, that's when the magic really starts to happen. And that's why I say until you get that aspect that makes it rotate around you, don't be afraid to lean on your arc lash. It's going to be a fantastic ability with that basic attack aspect that increases its attack speed. It's going to do really well for you. But once you get the aspect that makes this rotate around you, oh man, it's amazing. Now this is an ability you're going to max out. You're going to grab the first passive, which makes it attack faster. And then you're also going to grab the next passive here, Mage's Ball Lightning, which says after hitting close enemies 50 times with ball lightning, your next cast of it stuns enemies for 1 second. And you're going to be stunning enemies a lot. That's one of our primary objectives because when we stun enemies, we do more damage to them. So we have increased damage to stun enemies, but we also have increased sustain as a result of stunning enemies. We get resources back and stuff. So it's going to be really important to stun enemies as much as we can. We're also going to take the Inner Flames passive, but that's only so that we can get to Devouring Blaze. Devouring Blaze is why we took Firebolt enchantment way at the beginning. That sets things on fire when we attack them. And this says that you deal 21% increased critical strike damage against burning enemies. And that's multiplicative. So that's a nice buff to your damage, getting that 21% increased crit strike damage. This passive was heavily nerfed, but it's still that good. We're going to take it anyway. the last thing we're going to talk about in Mastery is the lightning passives here. And the first one is Static Charge, which says that our critical strikes with shock skills have a 15% chance to form crackling energy. Crackling energy is going to be important because it's damaging the enemies, it's stunning the enemies, and it's also going to be giving us resources back. So because of this right here, Invigorating Conduit, upon absorbing crackling energy, you gain 12 mana. And like any sorceress build, this one of the biggest hurdles is your mana. And so anything we can do to get more mana back more often is going to be very helpful for us. Next, we've got Shocking Impact. Shocking Impact, every time you stun an enemy, you deal lightning damage. So like I mentioned earlier, we're going to be stunning enemies as often as we can because that's going to be good for our sustain and it's going to be good for our damage. And then finally to the ultimate section. For our ultimate, we're going to take Unstable Current. This works really well with this build. What this says is whenever we cast a shock skill, a random core, conjuration, or mastery shock skill is also cast. So while this ultimate is up, it's doing massive damage. We're going to take both passives, the first of which is going to increase our attack speed by 25% while it's up. That's huge. 25% attack speed is going to be nice for getting those orbs up fast. Then we're also going to take Supreme Unstable Currents, which says that while Unstable Currents is active, crackling energy pulses 25% faster and costs no charges. Remember how we talked about those crackling energy earlier? As for the passives in the ultimate section, we're going to grab Coursing Currents. This says hitting enemies with shock skills increases your critical strike chance by 3% and resets upon getting a crit strike. So we want to be critically striking the enemy, 1 for the damage, 2 for all of the procs that we have based around crit striking enemies. What this does is every time we don't crit, it's going to increase our crit chance by 3%. So 3, 6, 9, 12 until we inevitably do crit and then it resets. So this is going to greatly limit the number of non-crits that we get. Basically, it's a really nice crit buff. We're going to max it out. Then we're going to grab Electrocution. We're going to put 1 point into this. You can put more into this if you want. You can take points out of Shocking Impact and you can put it in here if you find yourself needing more defense. Just go ahead and slide those points into here, 2 of them. And that way you're taking 15% less damage from enemies that you crit, which we're going to be constantly critting. So you'd pretty much always have that 15% damage reduction from this passive. Really nice to have. Then finally, we're going to grab Convulsions. This says that shock skills have a 9% chance to stun enemies for 3 seconds. Once again, crowd controlling enemies, which is going to be important for our sustain. It's going to be important for our damage. So that's a really nice one to have all around. Then finally, for our key passive, we are going to take Veer's Mastery. This says that close enemies take 15% increased damage from our shock skills and deal 20% less damage to us. So boom, there's a massive 20% damage reduction from the enemies that are near to us, which is pretty much going to be all of the ones that we're fighting because we're always going to run right up into their face with our rotating balls of lightning. This also says critical strikes increase these bonuses by 25% for 3 seconds. So you go ahead and you take that 15% and you make it 40% and you make that 20% less incoming damage and you make it a 45%, right? So this is just a massive buff for your character. Grab it as soon as you can. It's going to greatly increase your outgoing damage and greatly decrease the incoming damage you take. All right, next up, let's talk about our enchants that we're going to be taking. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Fireball for most of the game. Well, for the first half or more of the game, you're going to use Fireball. This is going to feel great for clearing overworld content. So if you're doing dungeons, overworld dungeons, blood tide events, or the hell tide events, right? If you're doing anything in the open world except for killing a world boss, this is what you want to use. Then when you get into the late game and you're doing high level nightmare dungeons or you're doing the new boss fights that were added to the game, that's when you're really going to want to switch Firebolt. And this is going to increase your single target damage. Okay. As for the other enchantment slot, you're going to use Ball Lightning enchantment. And what this says is critical strikes have a 25% chance to spawn a static ball lightning. So while you're sitting there beating on a boss, whenever you crit, there's a 25% chance another ball lightning will form and just sit there inside of the boss. And that's going to be great for your damage output, especially your single target damage output. All right, next up, let's go over the gear. I'm going to put the stats you're looking for each piece of gear in the written guide so that I don't have to read them all out loud to you now, because 1, that's kind of hard for you to remember, and 2, it's a lot for me to say. Instead, I'm going to go over the aspects here, and to find out what stats you're looking for on each piece of gear, refer to the written guide down in the description below. All right, first up for the helmet, what we're going to do is we're going to go with Disobedience on the helmet. Disobedience is going to increase our armor by up to 66%. That's massive. This is going to be great for our survivability. As a sorcerer, it's going to be a lot easier for us to cap out our resistances, which is very important. You want to get your resistances up to 70 for each resistance. By the time you're around 80 or so, you really want to be looking at capping those resistances out. So keep an eye on them. Your jewelry is going to give you all resistances and then a specific resistance slot. And then your helmet and your boots can also have pretty large sums of resistances on them. So if you need to go ahead and let your armor come with resistances now. I know last season that was a faux pas. Like if you had resistances on a piece of gear, let alone two, it was more or less bricked. We didn't use it. Now resistances are actually very important. If you run into a pack of enemies shooting fireballs at you and you don't have good fire resistance, you will die. So we're going to take Disobedience to increase our armor. That's going to protect us from the physical damage, which we're going to need because we're a sorcerer and we don't have a lot of access to armor from our Paragon tree. As for the chess aspect, we're going to use Shared Misery. The aspect of Shared Misery says that when you hit an enemy that's crowd controlled, there's a large chance that that crowd control effect will spread to the enemies around them. So that's great for us because we want to stun as many things as possible because we do much more damage to enemies that are stunned. And we also have a chance of getting resources back from those enemies. As for the gloves, we're going to go ahead and use the Rapid aspect. This is the one that's going to increase your basic attack speed by up to 30% if it's on your glove slot, up to 60% if you put it on a two-hander. And that's going to feel really good throughout the early game. Later on, when you need a multiplier instead of a basic attack speed increaser, you can switch that out for Edge Masters. On the pants, we're going to go ahead and use Aspect of Might. This is going to feel really good on this build. It's going to reduce the amount of damage you take by 20% for up to 6 seconds after you basic attack an enemy. So whenever you use your Arc Lash on an enemy, instantly you're going to take 20% less damage. So you have a lot of damage reduction on this build that comes after you hit the enemy. So you're going to be most susceptible to dying before you hit the enemy, right before you hit the enemy. So really make sure that you get those skills up and you get damage on the enemies as fast as possible. So you proc your Disobedience, so that you proc your Aspect of Might, get all these defensive aspects going and reducing the incoming damage before the enemy hits you if you can. Because of the way this build works, you're going to constantly be using your Orb Lightning and you're going to spam your basic attacks in between Orb Lightning casts. So you're basically going to have 100% uptime on this 20% damage reduction. On the boots, we're going to go with the Aspect of Fortune. This is going to give us up to 20% increased lucky hit chance anytime we have a barrier. One of many reasons we want barrier uptime to be really high and why we have so many sources of barrier in this build, because that lucky hit chance is giving us our sustain, it's giving us our damage, it's going to give us a lot of good things. And speaking of barrier, for our weapon, we're going to be using a wand. This is mainly so that we can get extra lucky hit chance on our offhand and also so that we can fit an extra aspect into the build. So if we went with a two-hander, it's probably easier to build because you don't have to manage upgrading two different items and their aspects, but you lose one aspect and you lose a ton of lucky hit chance if you go with a two-hander. So instead of a staff, we're going to take a wand. And with that wand, we're going to use the Storm Swell aspect. And that's going to make us do increased damage to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. And we always have a barrier. And our enemies are pretty much always going to be vulnerable because of one of the vampiric powers that we've got. We don't have to wait for Frost Nova to vulnerable enemies anymore. That's huge. As for the amulet, we're going to use the Aspect of Control. This is going to increase our damage by up to 35% against enemies that are frozen, stunned, immobilized. Any of those effects, we're going to be doing up to 35% more damage to those enemies, which is a huge buff for us. Now for our ring, the most important aspect for this build, and that's going to be the gravitational aspect. This is going to be the one that causes it to orbit around you. Unfortunately, this aspect cannot be found in a dungeon. You have to find it out in the game. So one thing you can do to find it is gamble for rings with your obols, or, you know, just hope that it drops from an enemy. I found mine right around like level 40, so it wasn't too bad. The build still works incredibly well until then. It gets carried by the Fireball enchantment and the Arc Lash until then. You can still use the Ball Lightning. It's just that it doesn't stick with you. You know, it kind of travels in a straight line. But once you get this aspect, man, it feels good. As for the other ring, that's going to be our Sustain aspect. You can use Prodigy, which is going to give you mana back every time you use one of your cooldown abilities. So that Teleport, the Flame Shield, the Frost Nova, right? You use any one of those and you're going to get mana back rather than spending mana, which is really nice. So you kind of slowly go through those so that you don't use one of them when you're already at full mana, wasting the mana that's coming back in from the Prodigy aspect. Alternatively, you could use Umbral, and Umbral is going to give you mana back every time you CC an enemy. And because we're constantly stunning our enemies, I mean constantly, we're stunning them, we're freezing them, our enemies are always crowd controlled on this build. So the Umbral would work incredibly well right up until you got to a boss fight, and you can't stun bosses, you can't crowd control bosses, so that's when Umbral does nothing. So as you're playing through the game, Umbral feels better better than Prodigy, like 99% of the time. But then as soon as you get to the boss, you're kind of wishing you had Prodigy. So it's up to you. Do you want to build for, you know, the trash fights or for the boss fights? I think the build's going to kill the trash just fine without Umbral. So if I was you, I would take Prodigy so that you're getting as much mana back as possible during those boss fights when you need it. And finally, for the offhand, we're going to take Conceited. This is going to increase our damage by up to 25% anytime we have a barrier. Another buff that happens while we have a barrier. So you can see why we wanted to have a lot of barriers on this character, on the Sorcerer. One, it makes us a lot less squishy, always having the barrier on. And two, we've just got so many different buffs that are tied to us actually having a barrier up. Now, some really important uniques to mention here, because late game, once you start farming those uber bosses that they've added, or if you happen to get lucky and get some of these earlier than that, these are going to be really powerful. The first of which is going to be a helmet, the Godslayer crown. This says that when you freeze or immobilize an elite enemy or damage a boss, it pulls in nearby enemies, which is nice. It's great for, you know, sucking everything into a nice small area, which is going to be great for your rotating balls around you. But also you deal 60% increased damage to those enemies for 3 seconds. So that's a massive damage buff when you suck them in. Now, this can only happen every 10 seconds. So this is nice, but this isn't an item I would say that you absolutely need to have. Then there is the chest armor, Raiment of the Infinite. This one has been amazing and a go-to for the Sorcerer since the game's launch, and it's still really good and it pairs really well with this build. So if you want to run Raiment of the Infinite on this build, you are absolutely welcome to. The way this works is you teleport into a group of enemies and it sucks them all in. And then of course you let loose on them with your ball lightning and they are immediately deleted. Once you get a nice amount of cooldown reduction on the build, the Raiment of Infinite can be a really fun one to use because it gets that teleport cooldown time low enough where you're able to constantly use it. This next unique is one that I would say you definitely want to try to get if you can. And by the way, some of these uniques can be target farmed from the new bosses. I'll put a link down in the description below that tells you which boss drops which unique. So that way you don't have to guess or whatever, and you can just click on that link and know exactly where to go if you're looking for, say, the Raiment of the Infinite, Duriel, by the way, and or any of these other uniques I'm talking about, right? They are all target farmable. They all drop from a specific boss now. So if you don't want to wait for RNG to bless you, you can go and you can just grab it by killing that boss. You know, you still have to get it to drop, but those bosses have a much smaller loot table. It's going to be much more likely to drop if you kill them. So this next one is Tybalt's Will. This is a pair of pants. This is going to be a really big one to get if you can. It's going to cause you to deal 40% increased damage while unstoppable. Remember how we have multiple sources of unstoppable, which was great for both our survivability and in this case, great for our damage. And when we become unstoppable, this is the one that causes us to get 50 of our primary resource back. We have at least 3 different abilities that are going to be making us unstoppable, which is fantastic. It's going to be our flame shield, our teleport, and then also our evade with one of the vampiric powers that we're going to touch on in a moment. Lots of unstoppable. That's 150 mana back whenever you want it. That's huge for the Sorcerer. And then the final unique that you could slide into this build if you would like to. It's not mandatory. Again, this is one that's fairly optional, but it would be nice to have because what it does is it reduces your active cooldown on your ultimate for each enemy you evade through. So what this one does is each enemy you evade through reduces your active ultimate cooldown by 4 seconds, up to a total of 10 seconds. So if you get a perfect roll on this, it's 4 seconds. It could be as low as 2 seconds for each enemy. You can reduce your cooldown by 10 seconds, which is massive in this game, being able to reduce your cooldown. This one isn't mandatory, and you would be sacrificing some other really great stats to take this unique. Since you can't re-roll the stats on it, you got to take what it gives to you. So it's a nice one to have. It could be fun to have if you get it. It will knock 10 seconds off of your ultimate, but you know, that's not a huge deal for this character. Now let's quickly touch on the last sections of this build, the vampiric powers added with the season and the Paragon Board. So for the vampiric powers, we're going to grab 5 of them. The first one we'll talk about is called Ravenous. This gives you a 20% chance to increase your attack speed by 40% of your total move speed for 6 seconds. This one is nice offensively. That's going to give you quite a bit of extra attack speed if you want it. However, another substitute, a great substitute for this one would be Resilience, which says that we get 1% damage reduction for every 2% health missing. So if you're missing 40% health, you're getting 20% damage reduction, right? That's huge. That is massive defense. So if you're feeling squishy, if you want to be more unkillable, you could instead use resilience. But if you want that offense all day, all the time, Ravenous is going to be your play. The next one is anticipation. This causes your ultimate skills to gain 20% cooldown reduction. So 20% off the cooldown of your ult, which is nice to have because our ult does do quite a bit for increasing our damage output. It's not everything, but it is effective at increasing our damage. But our ultimate is giving us the extra cast of the ball lightning. It is also increasing our attack speed by 25%. So this is a nice easy way to reduce that cooldown without giving up very much. Next, we have Prey on the Weak. This causes us to deal 16% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. It says that enemies are vulnerable when they are affected by vampiric curse. So what this one is doing is two things that are really good. One, 16% more damage to enemies, but two, it also says that it's causing any enemy that is afflicted with a vampiric curse to also be afflicted with vulnerable. That's new. That's really nice to have. That means as a sorcerer, we're not standing around all day waiting for our Frost Nova to come back up so we can do vulnerable damage to enemies and actually kill them. So this pairs perfectly with the next vampiric power that you're going to grab, which is Metamorphosis. This says that when you evade, you turn into a cloud of bats, becoming unstoppable. Remember, every time we become unstoppable, we get mana back and we increase our damage by 40%. So this plays into that as well. Real nice synergies all the way around. And inflict enemies along your path with vampiric curse. So when you evade through a group of enemies, you afflict all of them with vampiric curse, which means all of those enemies are also now vulnerable. So that covers our vampiric powers. Finally, we have the Paragon Board. As for the Paragon Board, it's early in the season, so this is kind of a living document. So I'm going to put it in the written guide linked down below instead of showing it to you here because it's something that I will likely refine as the season goes on to make sure that it's the best it can be for you guys. So for the Paragon Board, let's check out the build guide linked down in the description below. All right, guys, hopefully you found this video helpful and informative. If you did, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more Diablo content. I'll be covering this game every single season from here on out, so I hope to see you guys come on back. Massive shout out to this video sponsor. If you haven't yet, consider checking them out. They're linked in the description and the pinned comment below. And also a massive shout out to my channel members. Thank you so much for supporting the channel in the big way that you do. If you want to become a member of this channel and get special privileges like having your name appear on the end of every video and also access to a private Discord channel and more, be sure to click the join button down below. If you're not sure what to do next, maybe check out one of the videos popping up on screen, and I'll see you next time.